coming out to the last Praxis event of the semester. My name is Emma McCormick, and I'm the current president. Before we get into introductions, I would like to announce that Praxis is holding elections for the 2018 calendar year the Tuesday after Thanksgiving. That's 4 o'clock on the 28th in the formal lounge. All current members are eligible to apply. So if you did not receive an email earlier this week with the details, or if you do have more questions, please feel free to talk to any officer after the talk tonight. And then one final note, please fill out the Coke surveys that were on your chairs when you entered. That helps us continue to receive funding. And now I'm happy to introduce Alex Nowrasteh. He is an immigration policy analyst at the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. His popular publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, and most other major publications in the United States. His peer-reviewed academic publications have appeared in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Economic Affairs, and the Fletcher Security Review, the Journal of Bioeconomics, and Public Choice. Alex regularly appears on Fox News, MSNBC, Bloomberg, and numerous television and radio stations across the United States. He is a co-author of the booklet Open Immigration, Yay and Nay. He is a native of Southern California and received a BA in Economics from George Mason University and a Master of Science in Economic History from the London School of Economics. Please help me welcome Mr. Nowrasteh to Hillsdale College.
Thank you for that introduction and for inviting me out here today. One of the things I'm obsessed with beyond social science is whether I'm wrong or not. I spent my career for about 9 years or so working on the topic of immigration at the Cato Institute, and I've been arguing based on the peer-reviewed evidence in academic journals that immigration is a huge positive for the immigrants, for Americans, for our economy and society as a whole. But because I'm usually obsessed with whether I'm wrong or not, and it keeps me up at night, I try to think what's the best counter-argument to liberalized immigration? What's the best argument that an opponent could have that would convince me if the facts were true, if it lined up to this? So I've spent a lot of my time looking at this. I'm going to give you a very quick introduction about the main arguments you hear against immigration, very quickly why you shouldn't really consider them to be good, and then jump into what I think is the strongest argument, but still say why I think that fails. And I will say this, if the facts change, I will change my mind. I don't want to die on a hill of principle for no reason, so I just want to say that going forward. So first thing is, this is a highly simplified map, legal map, of our current immigration system. One of the saddest parts of my job is having to tell people that Ellis Island closed down a long time ago. Basically, there's 4 ways to get a green card in the United States. The most common one is to be closely related to an American. It's about 70% of them every year. The other way is by being highly skilled and sponsored by an American firm. It's only about 70,000 of those or so a year. Very regulated, very expensive. The third is by being a refugee or asylum seeker. Difficult to get into that. Not very many people make it. You're not really fortunate if you make it into that. Usually very bad things have to happen to you if you do. And then there's diversity visa. It's $50,000 a year given out in the lottery. So the category that's missing here is for low-skilled workers who don't have any family here. So it just doesn't exist anymore. This notion that you can show up, like a lot of our ancestors did at Ellis Island, wait in line, and if you don't have any diseases and you're not obviously a criminal, they let you in. That ended a very long time ago. If you apply these rules backwards in time, virtually none of us would be here today because none of our ancestors would have qualified. Now, the main reason why people come to the U.S. today and historically is economics. Americans make a lot more money, even controlling for skills and everything else. So economists have this measurement called a place premium. What they do is they take a look at the wage that an identical worker makes in the U.S. versus their home country. So this is for a high school graduate with 10 years of experience working. A Mexican with that kind of education can expect a threefold increase in wages by coming to the US. So it's a very tremendous increase in wages. Guatemalan, threefold. Indian, sixfold. Vietnamese, sixfold. Haitian, tenfold. So we're talking about very large gains in wages. Now, a lot of you have not been in the private labor market yet, or for very long. A lot of you are students, right? So you will eventually. You would be willing to move across the United States, I'd wager, for a threefold increase in wages after your first job. I mean, that would be a life-changing for you. Imagine going from making $5,000 a year, though, to making $15,000 or $30,000 a year. That's the difference between being able to make sure your kids, don't die from preventable diseases, and you have a roof over your head, and they have enough protein to grow to grow tall and to be prosperous, versus having large amount of infant mortality, dying, living in the cold, etc. So it's a huge difference. The median change across the developing world moving to the U.S. is a fourfold increase in income. So that's why people come. Now the reason why these incomes are so much greater in the U.S. is because these workers are more productive here. Wages are determined by your productivity, your marginal value product. How much can you make for an hour or for a given period of time? So that's why people make more here. So economists like to do these experiments. They build a model, and it's a good thing when we experiment with models. If we experimented in the real world, you all would suffer tremendously. So we experiment with mathematics. So we build a model of the global economy called a general equilibrium model. And then we say, okay, we got all these different wage rates in different countries based on productivity. What happens if we get rid of borders and allow people to move wherever they want? Wherever the wages are higher, what happens to global GDP? And the estimates are that global GDP increases by $35 to $105 trillion a year, which is 50 to 150%. Now, that is by allowing people to move from where they're unproductive to where they're productive. Now that's GDP. That's the annual amount of extra stuff made. So the present value of that is quadrillions of dollars, which quadrillion is a real number. I work in Washington, D.C., and they talk about trillion-dollar deficits every day, but a quadrillion is still a lot of money, though, compared to that. I would argue that compared to any other policy change you can make in the world today, this one conceivably would have the greatest impact on the global economy. Now, the reason why people are more productive in the U.S., and this is going to get to my point soon, is that we have better institutions, better culture, more capital, etc. We have contract rights, we have property rights, capitalism, security, good government. It's a joke, right? But it's better than almost everywhere else in the world. We know, pardon my French, we know how we're going to get screwed, mostly before it happens. And believe it or not, that is a benefit. I know the IRS is going to take a chunk. I know the EPA could ruin my business, etc. down the line. That is still better than having armed gangs run around and kill my family and take all our property, or the government doing that, etc. Right? So it's a marginal, but it's a big margin. So it's a big improvement. And that's why we're rich. It's not like we have better genetics or this land is magical or anything like that. So the benefits of free immigration in this scenario are huge, because in the U.S. we have these things that make us rich, make us wealthy. People come here, they can take advantage of these things, they can use them, make themselves and us wealthier in the process. Now these are the arguments you hear, and they're almost mostly bad. Immigrants will take our jobs. Immigrants in the welfare state don't mix, they're going to cost taxpayers. Immigrants don't assimilate, we need enforcement first before we do anything else. They're criminals, they're terrorists. The notion that we can't reform laws because somehow that would be against the rule of law. The last one, though, is the one that I think has the greatest likelihood of being true, and that is that immigrants will destroy our economic or political institutions. The things that make us rich, the things that make us dynamic, the things that make us different, is that somehow, through various potential mechanisms, immigrants who will come from poor societies, they come from places that are backwards politically and economically, mostly relative to the United States, will bring those bad things with them, whatever they are, and if enough of them come, it will ruin these institutions that we have in the United States. That's basically the theory. So, kills the goose that lays the golden egg. Immigration is good for the economy, but maybe if enough of them come in a short enough period of time, they'll undermine our institutions. Now, what do I mean by institutions? I mean in sort of the Doug North sense of the word. He was a Nobel Prize-winning economist. Basically, the rules of how the economy works, formal and informal. So formal would be like private property rights and contract rights. You can sue people, you can call police. Informal would be like cultural norms. Crime is low enough that I can talk to strangers, not have to worry that much about getting murdered, not have to worry that much about being robbed at gunpoint. As a result, we can make more business deals, exchange more things, trade is easier, etc. Formal rules, we all speak about the same language, and we can deal with each other pretty well. These are important. So these rules, though, private property, free markets, perhaps immigration will undermine these. Immigrants will undermine them. They'll vote for political parties or otherwise destroy these institutions, expand welfare benefits, ruin the fiscal state. So maybe, in other words, they take these bad institutions with them. Maybe if somebody comes here from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, they take with them, in some way, a lot of the bad institutions that made their home country poor, and it might make our country a little bit worse off. Ontologically, of course, in the way that these things work, institutions are collective. If I go to Cuba, I don't bring free markets with me. I have to deal with their system. But maybe if enough Americans go to Cuba, they will bring free markets with them. The other way is through changing culture. There's a lot of different theories about why we're rich. Culture is one of them. Maybe by having more immigrants here, it'll create what's called sort of a society of status, which is what matters is our relations to people. So like if we're in a clan, my obligation to my uncle or cousin is more important than my obligation to you, even though you and I signed a contract. In our society, we have a society of contract. Contracts are more important. They're more binding. If my uncle commits a murder, I don't suddenly jump out of my chair to go defend him against the police and fight a battle in the street like you do in a place like Somalia. So maybe immigrants will bring that with them and ruin it, and contracts are important. Maybe immigrants will vote for authoritarians, or maybe after watching the last election, they'll prompt Americans to vote for authoritarians. No, I'm sorry, I'm just joking. I think that applies maybe more in a place like France than it does the United States. So maybe immigrants will change natives and how we react to things and make us less supportive of free markets and these good institutions. So I'm going to go through a lot of these. So welfare. This is sort of the argument that you hear the most. Immigrants come here, they vote for welfare. More welfare is bad for our country, it's bad for the labor market, bad for institutions, bankrupts the government. Gary Becker, Nobel Prize winner in economics, sort of said it best. He said, quote, "When they become citizens, immigrants can vote on welfare, other entitlements, and all other government policies. Their votes affect everyone. The magnitude of these effects and others, which economists call externalities, is the main intellectual justification for control over immigration." So here he is, a man who admits that immigration is great for the economy, but it could worsen these other things that make it potentially in the long run a net negative. So as a simple model to try to understand this, total factor productivity. Just real quickly, this is the thing that makes us productive that isn't just counted in factories and education. So we're more than the sum of our parts in terms of this, sort of in the simple way of putting it. The model here is developed by Michael Clemens, and there's basically three portions to try to understand what immigrants bring with them in terms of undermining our institutions. So the first, or to bring they bring their bad TFP to our good TFP. And as a result, our good TFP gets worse. It degrades, we're not as productive, and productivity is the key to growth. So let's say they bring this with them, right? The first thing that he discusses is transmission. So an immigrant comes, brings this bad productivity with him. Some of it is absorbed in our country. Second portion is assimilation. Immigrants, their bad TFP, the thing that makes them unproductive, it adjusts over time. It converges and moves toward the American productivity, but at a certain rate. If too many of them come, then you get what's called congestion. If there's too many poor immigrants with bad TFP, then they don't assimilate as well, they don't assimilate as quickly, and maybe even the poor country, the rich country absorbs a lot of this and it becomes permanent. So this is a model that this guy, Michael Clemens, develops, and he empirically tested, looking around the world, at immigrants where they live. What he found is zero evidence. You take people from countries that are really poor, that have bad TFP, take a look at how it affects countries with good TFP going forward, zero impact, zero negative impact on economic growth. There was a slightly positive impact, such that more immigrants, especially from poor countries, is correlated with greater economic growth in countries going forward. So that's pretty strong evidence. Now, what about these institutions that I'm talking about? Private property, these issues. Over time, it's important to realize that immigrants and natives do have, in some measurements, some different ideas about these issues. The differences are overstated, but generally in poor countries, they're a little bit more collectivist, a little bit more anti-capitalist than the United States. There's exceptions to that. But over time, native opinions and immigrant opinions do change. They're not stuck in the mud, they're not stuck forever. Think of the stereotype of when you're 20, you're a socialist. I mean, not in this room. And then when you're 30 or 40, you become wiser and more supportive of free markets. In the same way, people change when they move across the world. So natives, the interesting thing though is that native opinions do change on these things dramatically. And one of the things that we see is that the more immigrants there are in a community or in a state or in a country, the more natives are opposed to government spending. The more they are opposed to welfare, the more they are opposed to high taxes to redistribute goods and services. Now, the research from Europe on this is substantial, and it's all fairly one-sided. So diversity produces less solidarity. And as a result of less solidarity, people like each other a little bit less. We get along a little bit less. We don't want to help each other a little bit less. The good thing from this is that means we also don't vote for welfare as much. If you don't like people around you as much as you used to, you are less likely to vote for policies to help them. That is one of the reasons why, when you take a look around the world, the largest, most complete welfare states are generally in homogeneous countries. So, I grew up my whole life hearing this stuff about how diversity is great, and all these phrases and mealy-mouthed sort of bad justifications that don't make any sense. This is an actual good result of diversity, is that we don't like each other as much, so we don't vote for welfare or socialism as much. A lot of people don't like that, but I like that. If I want to be provocative, you'd call this the positive externality of racism. I wouldn't argue that, but somebody might. So ethnic and racial diversity caused by immigration has shifted public opinion against welfare in many places around the world. Voters support welfare when the benefits are very similar to themselves, when the beneficiaries are. So Norway, Germany, Netherlands, United Kingdom. The sort of psychology behind this is people make excuses for themselves when they fail, right? Nobody says, oh man, I didn't work hard enough. I was so lazy. I had all these opportunities and I blew it because I slept in. People don't usually say that. What's interesting is people don't usually say that about people who look like them too, or who are very similar to them, etc. So people are more likely to blame people's problems on the person who's suffering them if they're different than them. So there's this wonderful book by this guy named Marx and Lipset, M-A-R-K-S, and Lipset. It's called It Didn't Happen Here, and it's about why the United States never really developed a labor party. And there are sections in there, I almost never quote Friedrich Engels, the communist. But he has a large section in there where Friedrich Engels wrote many letters to American communists and said socialism will happen last in America. And he didn't, pull all the ill-defined stuff about American culture being individualistic and, quoting, cherry-picking de Tocqueville and all this other, look at the Constitution to justify this and all this other stuff. He had a more empirical argument. He said the American working classes are super diverse. They don't speak the same languages. They come from all around the world. They have different religions. They don't like each other. So they're never going to band together to form a workers' movement because they don't get along. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. And you know what? I think I don't say this often about communists, but I think he was right. Now this translates in a weird way empirically. It's less true, it seems, when you look at welfare in the United States than it is in Europe. So I took a look with a colleague of mine, Zach Gokenauer, who's at James Madison University. What's interesting is in the United States, state governments have a tremendous amount of control over the size and benefit level of means-tested welfare programs within very broad ranges. But what's also cool is that across American states, you have very different ethnic and immigrant populations. So like I grew up in California. California is very different from North Dakota in terms of ethnicity, in terms of race, in terms of diversity, in terms of where immigrants come from, etc. But all these different places have policy over welfare programs. So we can take a look at how these things change. So we take a look in our paper at welfare from 1970 to 2010, and the population of blacks, Hispanics, Asians, immigrants, illegal immigrants, and the size of programs, means-tested welfare programs. And we found, and this is usually a boring result in papers, but we found no effect. No effect at all. Immigration or diversity is not correlated with greater welfare state. It's not correlated with a smaller one either. And there might be some reasons for that, but basically for every California with a lot of immigrants and diversity and a big welfare state, there's a Texas with a lot of immigrants, a lot of diversity, and a small welfare state. You know, for every New York State or New Jersey, there's a Florida or Arizona that counteracts that in terms of these policies. So it basically evens out to nothing. Now, there's a couple reasons for this maybe. The U.S. is quite a lot more tolerant than Europe. I mean, quite a lot. I don't know if you guys have lived in Europe, have you? I don't know, the only time I've been called like racial phrases to my face have been in Europe, so by people I don't know. And I didn't pick a fight, I swear to God. But the only time that's ever happened was when I lived in Europe. So it's easier to become an American. You know, Americans don't have a blood definition of what it means to be an American. That's like absurd. We have more of a sort of a cultural and civic identification for what it means to be an American. Not as true in Europe. I think it's moving in that direction. But this means that Americans might just see immigrants as American more rapidly than Europeans see immigrants as European. It might also mean that Americans sort of vent their discomfort about immigration or diversity in other areas, maybe criminal justice or other types of places. But basically the short answer is that immigrants don't make the welfare state worse in terms of the size of benefits, in terms of how available they are to people. Now, welfare is all well and good. What about economic freedom? Now, economic freedom score is something that my colleagues put together at Cato. Takes a look at 5 different factors. Takes a look at government spending, taxes, regulation, free trade, monetary policy, a few other things. And it sort of weights every economy in the world and every American state by how free it is economically. So a score of 10 is like the freest, score of 1 is the least free. So what we did was we took a look at every country in the world, and we took a look at the immigrant populations in these countries. Now, obviously, countries that have economic freedom, they're richer, so we have to account for that. So we basically take a look at immigrants in the past, and then how they affect economic freedom going forward. So we take a look at like who had a lot of immigrants in 1990, and then what happened to those countries' economic freedom scores by 2010, 2011. So they look at it afterwards. What we find is a globally a positive relationship. So the more immigrants in the past, the more economic freedom, the more improvement in economic freedom you get in a lot of these countries going forward. It's even a slightly positive relationship in the United States as a whole. Slightly negative across U.S. states, though. So typically, states you have a little bit more immigration, you have a touch less economic freedom. That doesn't matter so much for the U.S. because the standard deviation economic freedom, you know, one standard deviation is the difference between Georgia and Minnesota, so that's pretty small. Globally, the difference is between Germany and Cyprus, so that's kind of large. So it matters more historically or globally. What's also interesting is historically, big government and immigration restrictions go together. So this is a map of real federal outlays per capita in the United States. So this controls for population. And what this is it goes from 1900 to 2010. Now what happened about those lines right there is a time period when immigration was virtually closed off in the United States. The United States passed laws that basically stopped immigration from Europe during that time period. Some immigration was allowed during that time, but it was heavily, heavily restricted. America went from having a foreign-born population of 15% to less than 4% by 1965. So it was a very restricted period, the most restrictive in American history legally. However, during that time period, real federal outlays, between these red lines, real federal outlays rose 17-fold during these times. You had the New Deal, of course, World War II, you had NASA, you had all these other ways to govern money, you had the Great Society programs, etc. On either wing of this, though, the 30 years prior and the 40 years after, government spending per capita basically doubled over those two time periods. So correlation-wise over American history, I'm not making a causal argument, but correlation-wise, it seems that American government grows a lot more when immigration is restricted than when it's not restricted. Not saying it reverses, but it definitely grows a lot more. Now what's interesting is you do have a lot of people who make the causal argument here. I'll go into that a little bit later, actually. So that's one way to take a look and to measure sort of the, and by the way, that result was published, we published that in a peer-reviewed academic paper about the economic freedom. These other papers, I'll take a look at, we take something called an exogenous shock. So there's lots of things that can cause your economy or your society to change. One of the best things is an exogenous shock. It sort of creates a sort of quasi-natural experiment. And what this means is that you have a country, and in this situation, a large number of people move into it, all of a sudden, over a short period of time, but it wasn't because that country that received them did anything. It was that they were pushed out from somewhere else to that country. And then we see how that country's institutions change as a result. It's basically one of the best ways we can do. We can't do a lot of good experiments in social science unless we're in the lab, and that doesn't help here. So we have a couple cool experiments, one of them in Israel. 1990 and 1995, the Soviet Union allowed Jews to leave, and because of the law of return in Israel, they could all go to Israel, and they could almost immediately become citizens, voting in Israel. That increased Israel's population by 20% in about 5 years. So you're talking about a very large increase of people in a short amount of time. Today, that would be as if about over 60 million people moved to the US in a 5-year period, relative to that. So huge, right? Huge change in their society very rapidly. Jordan is another example. From 1990 to 1991, Jordan population increased by 10% because of Palestinians who have been living in Kuwait, sometimes for decades, were forced out by the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And due to a weird quirk in Jordanian law, they too got the right to vote immediately upon going there. So you have a huge increase in the population very rapidly. We can see what happened to their economic freedom scores. Now I use a method called synthetic controls, sort of a fancy new econometric method. But what it is if I have an Israel, right, in 1990, I can't, and I want to see what happens to Israel after that, I have nothing to compare it to because there's only one Israel. So what this method does is it creates a synthetic or artificial Israel in the data. I take a look at the things that influence its economic freedom, and I build an artificial one. And then I see what happens if those change when those immigrants come. That's basically what it is. A lot of fancy math, whatever, you can take it or leave it. But a lot of economists love it, so we did it. Now what the next graph you're going to see is this vertical line is when the immigrants come. Real Israel is the shaded line, is the solid line is the real Israel, the fake Israel, the synthetic one is the dashed line. And right here on the y-axis on the left-hand side, that's the economic freedom score. So remember, higher economic freedom score, more freedom. What we see beginning in 1990 is a change, a dramatic change in divergence in terms of these economic freedom scores to a radical extent, such that Israel goes from basically, and this is real Israel in the blue, synthetic Israel purple, the OECD and Europe average. The OECD average is sort of at the top there in that purple, and the Middle East, North Africa average is the green. Basically, Israel goes from looking like a Middle East and North African country bad institutions, not very much economic freedom, to looking like an OECD country very rapidly. Now when you take a look at the things that changed in Israel prior to this, you take a look at what changed in this time, you can make a very good case that it was this immigration that did it. The Jews that went to Israel at that time, there was rapid growth in a lot of the free market political parties in Israel. A lot of the Jews either voted for them or voted for other political parties, but it was a good justification. We published this paper in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. But what's cool is that it didn't make anything worse. And there's a lot of evidence that it at least made it a lot better. Another example is Jordan. I gave you that example. Jordan goes from looking like, and real Jordan is in the solid line, synthetic Jordan is in the dashed line, that vertical line is when the immigrants all went to Jordan, that huge wave in about a 1 year period. Jordan begins to change immediately in terms of its economic freedom score. And it changes and diverges from synthetic Israel to such a huge extent that it goes from looking like a Middle Eastern country, in terms of its score a little bit better than other Middle Eastern countries, but it looks like them, to basically looking like a European country in terms of its economic freedom. So a very rapid, dramatic change in a short period of time. This paper is still a working paper, but I can go into why I think this is. It's sort of a complicated story. But basically, the Palestinians were a sort of, they were like the bourgeoisie. They were sort of not in the government of Jordan. They weren't in a ruling coalition. They couldn't really get welfare that much. They didn't have state-subsidized industries. You know, they didn't work in the government as much, but they paid a lot of the taxes. So what happened is by having all these people who came to their country all of a sudden, who were basically part of this group, who brought money with them, who were small business owners, who were sort of bourgeoisie, started small businesses, it changed the ruling coalition so that the government had to be more friendly to them. And they argued and lobbied for deregulation, and they got it as a way to sort of be part of the governing coalition. Now what's interesting is, I talked about the American history, right? That change that suddenly happened, where you had those immigration restrictions, and then all of a sudden, the government started to grow dramatically in the 1930s and 1970s. I'm not sure if it's causal or not, but many left-wingers do think it is. Seymour Martin Lipset, I quoted him, Gary Marx, Vernon M. Briggs Jr., a labor economist at Cornell who recently died, Michael Lind, he's sort of this like neoconservative, but mostly a liberal type guy who writes nonsense about economic history, and he agrees that diversity is very bad for a large government that he likes, Friedrich Engels, and my favorite quote of all time from Paul Krugman, the New Deal made America a vastly better place, yet it probably wouldn't have been possible without the immigration restrictions that went into effect after World War I. For one thing, absent these restrictions, there would have been many claims, justified or not, about people flocking to America to take advantage of welfare programs. Sounds like a great argument for open borders to me. Now another argument you hear, and this is made mainly by professors like Garrett Jones at George Mason University, is that our economic development is not really based so much on our institutions, but basically how long have we been developed and the types of culture that we have and how old it is. So you basically take a look at a bunch of these different metrics, which is how long your ancestors have had agriculture, how long they've had a settled state, how long they've had high technological development, and that's like a really good prediction. So the longer you've had this stuff in your past, the more likely you are to be rich in the future. Now, there's a lot of problems with this. The biggest problem with it is that there are 3 big outliers, or 4 big outliers. One, China should be a lot richer than it is. China's been settled for a long time. Big state. India should be a lot richer than it is. And the Middle East should be a lot richer than it is. Especially, you know what country should be the richest, by the way, according to this measurement of the world? It has the longest history of settled agriculture, the longest history of states, and at the forefront of technological development. You want to guess? Yeah, Syria should be the richest country in the world, according to this measurement. So, one outlier doesn't make it different, it doesn't ruin a model, but it should tell you something, right? Oh, by the way, the US and Europe should be a lot poorer, according to this. Another argument here is trust and social cohesion. Immigrants typically don't trust as well as other people. So maybe increased diversity. There's a lot of work on this by Robert Putnam. More diversity, people don't trust each other as much, they hunker down, they don't leave their houses, yada, yada, yada. That's bad for growth. What's interesting is there's two different types of not trusting people. There's fractionalization, and there's polarization. Polarization is where we hate each other so much that we basically want to kill each other. That's bad. That's an uncontroversial statement, I think, right? Wanting to kill people because they're different is pretty bad. But there's fractionalization, which is we're diverse, we don't like each other so much, but we don't hate each other so much that we want to kill each other. That's actually good for growth, for all the reasons that I made before. Trusting other people is bad if you do it too much, because you vote for really bad policies. So that's a very interesting thing. So when we talk about trust assimilation in the United States, this is from the General Social Survey. And this is it's a question that General Social Survey is the largest biennial survey in the United States. They ask all these questions about your opinions, your background, whether you're an immigrant, etc. And they ask you questions. And one of them they ask is, can people be trusted, like in general? Sort of a general trust question. First generation in blue, those are the immigrants. Second are their kids. Third are their grandkids. And the fourth plus are, the longer Southern Americans, the true Americans in a lot of people's mindset. First generation, it is the lowest. In terms of can people be trusted? They're the least trusting, right? 22.6%. Second generation gets a little better, 26.4%, and then it peaks in third for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe it's the particular people there, and then it goes right back down in the fourth generation. But there tends to be a little bit of assimilation, and it's not so wildly different, especially from the third generation, fourth plus, that it should really worry us. Culture. Now, what's interesting is for some groups of people, some ethnic groups, in particular immigrant groups, trust is a little sticky across generations. Culture is, of course, sticky. If you talk to people who self-identify as Italian Americans, they do things a little differently. They do have some different answers to questions and surveys, etc., than other Americans who identify as other groups. That's true. In some groups, like people from southern Italy, and their descendants do tend to trust a little bit less than people who come from northern European countries like Sweden, or whose ancestors do. But the bad thing is that more trust generally leads to more cooperation in places like politics too, and more cooperation in politics generally means a bigger government. So that's not necessarily a good thing. What's interesting though is that trust, and the trust measure, and I mean this generally as sort of somebody who works with economics and works with data a lot, it's kind of a fuzzy thing in economics. What does it mean, trust? Are you actually, does it matter how much you trust other people? Does it matter how trustworthy you are? Do you actually do what you say you're going to do? Etc. Which impacts which? Is it behavior that changes your trust opinion, or is it trust opinion that changes your behavior? Maybe trust is created by institutions, those rules that I talk about in the game. Maybe the reason why people don't trust each other in poor countries is because they have bad governments that don't reward trust. Why would you trust people if the police can rob you, your neighbors can rob you, and there's no punishment for that? So maybe by coming here to a place where it's pretty good, trust changes a lot. Anyway, we can't measure it very well. What kind of question is that anyway? I do trust people. So anyway, I'm a little skeptical of that whole line of research, but even if it's a good one, it doesn't really point in the direction that it's bad. Cultural uniformity. One of the interesting things is since the age of nationalism, since about the 1650s when nationalism first started and then really exploded and expanded in the 19th century, nationalist governments try to basically, in the words of James C. Scott, the political science and sociologist, make states legible. They try to make them uniform so that they can govern them easier. Uniformity makes it easier to govern. So standard language, for instance, France has tried for centuries to wipe out non-French languages spoken throughout their country. They've succeeded in most areas, but they're still not done yet. Units of measurement, they try to outlaw other units of measurement. Names, standardization of names, religion, etc. Some states do this more than others. They basically do this to make it easier to conscript people into the military, to tax them easier, to regulate them, etc. That's the reason why governments do a lot of these things. What's interesting is cultural heterogeneity. If these things differ, it makes it a lot harder for a central state to accomplish its statist goals. Makes it more costly, makes it more difficult, makes people less willing to go along. I mean, what if, for instance, you're a Catholic in a Protestant country, and the government has decided that people need to be Protestants because it's easier to govern them that way? Are you going to go along with that? Probably not. You're going to be a little skeptical, right? So you're going to be a little more less in favor of the government having any kind of power in that way. And that goes for the rest of these goals. Now, what about the micro level? What about opinions? What's interesting is, what if immigrants have just different opinions about all these different policy areas, size of government, etc.? And what if this carries on through generations? So their second generation has the same bad opinion, the third the same bad opinion. Over time, this cohort grows because there's more immigrants and they all have kids and etc. And over the generations, maybe their bad opinions will take over. And as we know, the good thing about democracy is that it does generally what voters want. The bad thing about democracy is it does generally what voters want. And I mean that with love and affection, because I love you guys as voters. But it's not very good at deciding what's true, but it is good at deciding opinions. So here's the question. General social survey. First generation red, second generation yellow, third generation green, fourth generation and above is blue. This is ideology. It asks, are you an extreme liberal to extreme conservative? And these are the opinions by generation. There is no statistically significant difference between the first generation and the fourth generation for any of these. They're all within the margin of error in terms of from extreme liberal to extreme conservative. What about the question, government spending on welfare? Too little, about right, too much. All within the margin of error in terms of this, between people who say too little, about right, too much. Federal income taxes. Are they too high, about right, too low? I mean, I don't know if it says too low. I'm going to show you, by the way, look at the comparison, right? Government spending on welfare, federal income taxes. Yeah, trying to figure it out, right? No transitivity property in politics. No statistically significant differences. Social Security benefit level, they all think about the same. In fact, these are all within the margin of error. Too little, about right, too much. Government assistance to the poor, same story, all about the same. This is the one where the differences are the biggest. Immigration. Immigrants like immigration a lot more than natives do. This is the only one. This is the only policy area with the exception of marijuana legalization where immigrants have consistently different opinions than fourth generation plus Americans. They like immigrants a lot more. Immigrants also dislike marijuana. I won't hold that against them too much. But, so I would argue that in my home state of California, you see this most clearly, but I would argue that that main huge difference in terms of immigration, which is the biggest policy difference, is the reason why immigrants overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party, and they have voted for the Democratic Party since 1798, every single immigrant cohort, overwhelmingly, with the exception of the Irish in Philadelphia, the Cubans, Vietnamese, and a handful of other small groups like the Germans right before and after the Civil War, overwhelmingly Democratic. And the reason why is, whether you like it or not, the Democratic Party has said better things about immigrants historically. They typically favor better policies that are more in line with immigrant opinions. And this is no more true than in the state, I think, of California, my home state. California has off-year gubernatorial elections. So that's what I want you to focus on. 1986, 1990, 1994, 1998. 1986 and 1990, you have the Hispanic vote for the Democratic Party, first column, Hispanic vote for the GOP, and then at the end you have the net edge that the Hispanics gave the Democratic candidate in the final election. And then right next to it is the Hispanic percentage of the entire vote in California. So California went from the whitest state in the Union in 1960 to the least white state in 1990. So a really rapid change, very quick, due to Hispanic immigration into the state. What happened? 1986, The Republican candidate, Democratic candidate for governor, they didn't really say anything about immigration. It wasn't an issue. You can see the Republican got 46% of the Hispanic vote. The Democrat got 52%. That gave a net edge of 0.4% to the Republican in the general election. That's nothing. That's small. 1990, Pete Wilson's first term running for governor. He got 53%. The Democrat got 53% of the Hispanic vote. He got 47%. They basically split it. Very close, right? 1990. That gave the Democratic candidate a net edge of 0.3 just by itself in the popular vote. Not enough to win. Pete Wilson won that election. 1994. Things are bad in California. We won the Cold War. Bad for defense firms in California. Poor economy. The economy nationwide wasn't doing very well. Pretty slow. Remember, like a housing bubble burst. There was low economic growth, a lot of unemployment. Pete Wilson was not going to win re-election. He looked around and he was like, hey, who can I blame for stuff going bad? He decided to blame illegal immigrants from Mexico who were supposedly ruining the state. His supporters were not so careful. They blamed immigrants in general. Everybody knew what immigrants they were talking about. They were talking about Mexicans in the state. At the same time, there was a popular ballot initiative called Prop 187. Did one thing that was good, which was ban all welfare for illegal immigrants, which was already the law. That was already the law, but they decided to put that in a ballot initiative because it's California, and we do stupid things in California by ballot initiatives. And it also said that every single time a government employee comes in contact with somebody who they think is an illegal immigrant, they have to report them to the INS to investigate them. So this would be like in schools, etc., any kind of contact. Anyway, as a result of this, the Hispanics in that state, the voters, 71% vote for the Democrat in that election, and 25% voted for the GOP. So you see a huge shift from 1990. They go from splitting it to, instead, there's basically 3-1 in favor of the Democrat. That by itself gave the Democratic candidate an edge of plus 4.1% in the general election. At this stage in 1994, Hispanics made up 9% of the electorate. That was not enough to get the Democrat in office. Pete Wilson got a lot more of the white vote. Pete Wilson won that election as a Republican. The problem is, and I got this from Michael Barone, the political commentator, Michael Barone asked his grandfather when he was a kid, why does the family vote Republican? And his grandfather said it's because the Confederates burned the barn in the Civil War. The Confederates were, overwhelmingly Democratic. People hold on to things that make them mad. They hold on to things where people target them because of their identities, and that seems to last. And it lasted in 1994, where the Democrat got 78% of the Hispanic vote. The GOP governor got 17%. Due to the increase in the size of the electorate of Hispanics to 14%, that gave a net edge to the Democrats in the gubernatorial election of 8.5 points. Overwhelming. Very difficult to surmount that. Gray Davis won that election. The only time we've had a California since then was Arnold Schwarzenegger as a Republican governor, and that's because of a weird situation both times. The state is overwhelmingly Democratic as a result of this. There was a vast amount of evidence, even beyond this, that I can share with you later if you'd like. But basically, the California GOP declared war on illegal immigrants. A lot of them declared war on immigrants politically, and they and their descendants did not take it too kindly. You should contrast this, by the way, to the state of Texas. California and Texas have the exact same percentage of the population as Hispanic, 39.6%. It's out to the decimal point, 39.6%. Radically different political outcomes, radically different vote shares. They in Texas, split the vote on the state level. Hispanics, Republicans do with Democrats on this. And I would argue it's because the Texas GOP is one of the smartest in the country and did not intentionally alienate the fastest growing demographic in their state. So I would say again, the best argument against immigration is that they will somehow kill the economic goose that lays the golden eggs by overturning institutions or whatever makes us wealthy. So basically, will the long-term potential costs of immigration outweigh the large, immediate, huge economic benefits of it? I believe that the historical evidence, the economic freedom score evidence, exogenous shock data, policy opinions, assimilation evidence, and a lot of sort of recent case studies in American history suggest that probably not. I'm fairly confident that they won't, but if you all have any counter arguments, I'd love to hear them. Anyway, that's my best argument against immigration. I think we have time for some questions. And I can answer about this or anything else in immigration if you're curious.
So you had Germany up there on the list of fairly homogenous countries that have a large welfare state. Now that they've had this huge influx of immigration, how will that affect their voting and their welfare?
Great question. So we've already seen in German public polling data falls in support for redistribution, falls in support for welfare state. The Christian Democratic Party under Angela Merkel has, they've always been in favor of labor market reforms. They pushed that a little further now since this sort of surge in the Syrian migrants that have come there. There's been an increase in vote share for the FDP and some other parties in Germany that are more free market oriented. And what's interesting is that even a lot of the nativist parties in Germany and in the rest of Europe, they're more of a welfare for me, not for thee type parties. You know, they want to build a wall around welfare and keep all the natives in, but exclude all the immigrants. That's still a movement in the right direction in terms of improving welfare policy. I don't really like the National Socialist intentions or slogans, but in terms of their voting in the European parliaments and government houses, there is much, much less support for redistribution than there used to be. We need to do more systematic data on it, but it's still pretty early to be able to tell. So we don't really, that'll change more in the future. One of the things is a lot of those Syrians are going back because the war is basically slowed down a lot. So some of them are going back or going to other European countries. So we'll see how that changes more going forward. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I grew up in California and in Fresno.
Yeah.
And they had the Bracero program when I was growing up, where you could come in and work and then go back and forth. And I was wondering if, when that program became defunct, did that make it so that more illegal immigrants came in and brought their families and stayed?
Absolutely, 100%. You think like an economist. Are you an economist?
Yes.
Well,
I also grew up in Fresno. So
yeah,
I know.
so you know.
I was there.
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. So let's give you a background on the Bracero program. It was a temporary program for Mexican farm workers, basically numerically unlimited. You could come up, work on a farm, go back and forth. Started in 1942, ended in 1964. Ended because primarily labor unions argued. Cesar Chavez, you heard of that guy? They want to make him like the Hispanic Martin Luther King. He born in Arizona. He was the head of the Grape Pickers Union. He basically, you heard about these people who go down to the border with their militias and like patrol to keep out illegal immigrants. His group was the first basically to do that because they argued that these people were coming up, making it impossible to unionize. They formed what they called a wet line. They called it along the border to beat migrants up who came in. They went around the farms, they reported migrant workers to the INS for deportation, they beat up workers, I mean, just a bunch of nasty, nasty stuff that they did. He used racial slurs, like in testimony in front of Congress. He apologized for it when he was on his deathbed, like I care, right? But like, but that program was great. Like, when that program was really, had a lot of problems at the beginning, but it was basically deregulated in 1952, 1953. In that year, there were about 2 million illegal Mexican immigrants in the U.S. The next year, because they could all get these permits, that number fell by over 90%. The number of people crossing the border illegally fell by over 95%. There was really no increase in border patrol. It was the best possible way. The government can't regulate a black market. It can really only regulate the legal market. They were able to regulate the entry, know who it was, allow them to come in legally. They even went so far, the Border Patrol and INS at the time, is when they found an illegal immigrant working, they would do what they call a spot legalization, where they like take their picture, write down their name, give them a work permit, or they do what they call walk around the statute, because technically you entered illegally, right, if you were an illegal immigrant. So what they did was they put you in a truck, drive you to the border, take one step over into Mexico, one step back over in the US, hand you your permit, and drive you back to your farm. That got rid of illegal immigration very rapidly. So basically the entries go from hundreds of thousands per year illegally to in the low tens of thousands very quickly. As soon as this program ended, because this program did not destroy the farm industry, it did not get rid of the demand for these workers, they instead started to come illegally. And you see a huge surge after that. And we've done some, because the data on immigration kind of is terrible, we've done as much as we possibly can with multivariable regressions to try to figure out the correlation. And basically, the number of guest workers available for low-skilled workers is very negatively correlated with illegal entries, to a statistically significant extent more than anything else, more than Border Patrol agents, more than economic growth, more than in any country, more than the wage difference, more than anything else. So yeah, the way to get rid of illegal immigration is to have legal immigration. Yes, sir?
The exogenous shocks you were talking about with Soviet Jews going to Israel and Palestinians going to Jordan, is that a good comparison? Because those were two people groups that were going to places that they were already the majority people group. So you're using that for an argument for immigration in the United States where the people that are coming here wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, that's a pretty decent counter argument. So the interesting thing about the Soviet Jews is that they are overwhelmingly secular. Only something like 8% of them had any knowledge of Hebrew. They were for the majority of them, non-practicing. They didn't speak, they spoke Russian. They had very different skill sets than the other Israelis. So although they were part of a similar ethnic group, they were not so religiously attuned. They had to set up religion classes for a lot of them when they came to Israel. So they're a little bit more different than it seems like on paper compared, and there's still like cultural clashes. I mean, a lot of these groups still speak like Russian amongst each other and stuff, which is a very, it's an entirely different language group from Hebrew and, well, it's Indo-European, but it's, and Hebrew is Semitic language group. So they're very different in that way. But that's a good point. They at least have that thing they can point to, right? They also have in common. It's a much better argument in Jordan, but the interesting thing in Jordan is that these sort of native Transjordanians and the Palestinians really hate each other. It's like, when people are alike, they kind of, sometimes they don't like each other. They make up things to this, so they really just don't like each other. In fact, the Transjordanians were worried about Palestinians coming to Jordan because they might actually one day become the majority, and therefore that'd be horrible, and lo and behold, today they are. So, it's one of these things where, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's less of a good example because they also spoke Arabic, they're all Sunni Muslims, so they have that in common. So they're not like the best examples compared to the United States. I'll say that. The reason why I like the Jordan example is that Jordan is a much more fragile country than Israel or France or the United States. So what I like is that even in a place where the institutions are more fragile, they still adapted in a pretty good direction. Which makes me think the findings are a little bit more robust. Yes?
I've seen quite a few studies, and it does show that the effect on wages of most Americans is positive. When there's more immigration, most Americans actually do get to make more money, with one exception, which is the low-income people. And I've seen you on Tucker Carlson, and he's turned into a champion of the low-income folks,
Yeah,
right?
it's funny, huh?
There's a populist streak, obviously, running big time through the Republican Party right now. So how do you answer that? That is actually usually the people that the low-skilled immigrants are competing with when they come here.
Yeah, it's people, and just to expand on what you're talking about, most economic findings will find very small effect on American wages from immigration. With what the professor said, most Americans have wage gains. The exception, though, is those with less than a high school degree. Not always, but in some studies, those with less than a high school degree who are Americans do compete with a lot of low-skilled immigrants, and their wages decline. The largest increase is recorded by George Borjas, who's a Harvard professor. He took a look at the 30 million or so, basically from 1990 to 2010, when about 30 million or so immigrants entered the United States. Not most, but a plurality were low, less than high school degree. And he estimates that they lowered the wages, the relative wages of high school dropouts by about 1.7%. So, 1.7%, it's something, it's not much. But we're talking about a pretty small percentage. So what I'll say is like 1, it's a pretty small percent. 2, Americans who are adults who are dropouts make up less than 10% of the workforce. Less than 10% of the people, and much less than that in terms of the workforce. Secondly, the way to get those low-skilled people to make higher wages is that they increase their education and their skills. They get a high school degree, which is pretty, for you, you don't pay the cost of that generally. It's for them to get that. Raising the wages, let's say, even if it were to happen, even if restricting immigration were to happen, that would raise the wages of dropouts, that doesn't make it so that they want to get a higher degree, right? I mean, if you want people to get a higher degree and to get more skills, you don't want to make them comfortable where they are. And then I'd say the biggest things that really hold back Americans who are dropouts is the welfare state, which basically, no matter what they say about work requirements, pays people not to work. It's crime in the criminal justice system, especially with drugs. This is totally understudied, so if anybody here wants to do work on this, we don't even know the number of Americans who have ever been incarcerated in the United States or have a criminal record like that. We don't even know. They don't ask that question in the census. But it's many, many, many millions, and that severely damages your chance of getting a job later on. A lot of those people are low-skilled, high school dropouts. So there's I can think of almost every other policy in that way. And what I'd say, I wouldn't say this on television, but I'll say this to you all because you all are intellectually curious and honest. But I am not that interested in making people, 90% of Americans, worse off, and every immigrant worse off, to help increase the wages, relative wages of high school dropouts by 1.7% of people who could, with no cost to themselves, have done the simple thing of graduating high school and helping themselves. I mean, I don't think that, I don't know what the excuse is for that. There might be some excuses here or there at an individual level, but for the vast majority of these folks, graduate high school, get a GED. It's not the foreigners who are holding it back, let me put it that way. You should look in the mirror. Generally in America, poor people are to blame for their own problems. Yeah. Yes?
So with respect to social cohesion, you talked about fractionalism having a net positive effect on economic growth and polarization having a net negative effect.
Yeah.
To my understanding, the distinction between the two is just the degree of diversity. Isn't that an argument for moderation in immigration? And how do we determine at what point does fractionalization become polarization?
So the major research on this in terms of immigration in the United States and across the world looks at sort of a lot of social problems that arise from this, and they try to measure polarization in that way by sort of the conflict that arises. So there's a lot of evidence of, say, like terrorism from certain groups in the United States, like in the early 20th century, like the Gallianists, who were Italian anarchists who set off hundreds of bombs. There was also the labor movement in the early 20th century. Immigrants were involved in that. It was pretty violent, mostly started by the workers. You don't hear about that in public school very often. Or I did, but I got kicked out of classes. Bringing it up. So things like this. So they take a look, they try to measure it in terms of that, like where is the violence in the United States, and then they take a look at like the state level economic growth, and they sort of work backwards to get the state level economic growth. So that's basically how they try to figure it out with a lot of the data inside of the United States with the polarization or fractionalization. Now, in terms of immigration moderation, it might be more, it depends. One of the interesting things is when there are two big groups that don't like each other, you usually get worse results than when you have a bunch of smaller groups. So right now, as of like 2008, Hispanics were the largest proportion of immigrants that any immigrant group has ever had in the United States. Now, that Hispanics, though, hides a lot of diversity, so I don't know if you know many people who are of different Hispanic background, but Cubans hate Mexicans, and they all hate Puerto Ricans, and they all like Cuban Colombians, so there's not much solid. People in different states in Mexico don't really like each other very much. You know, there's not a whole lot of solidarity there that we can really point to in that. So there's less solidarity than it seems just on its surface, and that is changing very rapidly. So we've witnessed the end of basically Hispanic immigration to the United States in terms of that, beginning in about 2008. It's dropped off dramatically. Every year since 2009, Asians have outnumbered Hispanics as new immigrants, and that gulf is getting wider and wider. So I would argue that if these effects are true, it's probably more of an argument for diversifying the immigrant stream in terms of ethnicity, background, etc. So that instead of having like one large group dominate, you have a whole, maybe the same numbers or more, but from more areas. So more Europeans, Brazilians, Africans, whatever. Good question.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.